February, Shabbat, February the 28th, 1981, Bayakhel. The previous sermon was the 21st of February 1981. That unfortunate lapse of the tongue, which of course could equally be taken in a complimentary vein, reminds me of the story of the rabbi who had to go to New York University Medical Center with a massive coronary and received a cable from the Board of Trustees the next day, which ran, "We wish you a refuah shlema, a speedy recovery. 10 in favor, 8 against, 6 abstentions." Well, Cantor Nathanson, of course, is very much on my mind and heart. We buried him from this synagogue only a few hours ago, and his presence is very much in the synagogue. It's been an extended family week. We lost our beloved emeritus cantor. Blanche is going to have surgery on Monday or Tuesday. Abigail's bat mitzvah, and of course, we had a new baby, and we congratulate in absentia Irvin Rosenthal and Ruth Jarmel, or should I put it the other way around, I think, Ruth Jarmel and Irvin Rosenthal, although Ruth tells me that Irvin was there all the way. Labor began at 4 o'clock on Tuesday morning and ended at 10:30, and they were both fighting together the entire time, apparently. I mean, fighting in the best sense of the word. A baby girl, Rebecca, 7 pounds. I couldn't ascertain how tall she was because they hadn't measured her yet. But anyway, it's a healthy girl, and the SAJ has grown this week, and this is a week in the life of a congregation. Birth, death, bat mitzvah. We even had a marriage only a few days ago, Mark Summerstein, Lynn. We turn to the Birnbaum Siddur, which we are studying, and the section of the morning service, which we are currently studying, which commences on page 71, culminates in the Shema, the central affirmation of Jewish religion, on page 75. That is to say, the affirmation on page 71 that God creates light and darkness, peace and all things, which includes evil. The original verse from the book of Isaiah, in fact, stipulates that God creates peace and evil. The rabbis had some difficulty in including the entire text in the prayer book and modified the last statement. Culminates in the affirmation on page 75 that God is one, whatever that means. And in between those 2 points, 2 other affirmations are made central to Jewish thinking. The first being that God created the world. This, of course, is the traditional perspective, and the first blessings on page 72 refer to the renewing of the work of creation every day. That not only did God create the world at a beginning of time, but that he continues to renew the work of creation. And this is followed by a prayer at the bottom of page 73, which affirms God as the one who revealed the Torah. So, that is to say, in this section of the Shacharit service, the idea of the unity of God is the, as it were, bracketing, or God, the oneness of God brackets the two affirmations that God created the world and there's ongoing creativity, and also that there is revelation, that man is informed or told by God what he is to do. Now, I see we have visitors with us this morning, and although I can't recapitulate everything that I've been talking about for the last 20 years in the space of a few moments, I would like to explain to you that although a dissertation on the unity of God might seem a rather boring thing to indulge in on a Saturday morning, especially when one is a captive audience or part of a captive audience, it actually is a very exciting theme. Anybody who has watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos, even one of those programs, and had some sense of the awe and the mystery of the size of the universe which modern science exhibits manifest to us, must surely be interested on some level of his or her mind as to what all that stuff is doing out there. And in a sense, what we are discussing here is, I suppose you could say, is the cosmos alive in any sense? Any you ever thought of that question? Is the cosmos alive? Does it have any vitality? We know that a dog is alive, and a cat is alive, and an elephant is alive, and a monkey is alive. Of course, human beings are alive. And in a sense, palm trees are alive, and potatoes are alive. But is the cosmos alive? Has that question ever got you? If it hasn't, I'm afraid that any kind of a dissertation on the unity of God is going to become rather boring. But that's the kind of question that we're looking into. Is the cosmos alive, or is life only in those parts of the universe where we are? And does the affirmation about God as life only really apply to us? And again, the question, what does all that stuff have to do with Auschwitz, with suffering, with surgery, with hospitals, with pain, with death? In other words, is there any meaning or purpose in life? These are big questions. We continue to discuss them in an ongoing vein in the synagogue because we believe that this is the only place where these subjects are discussed in their proper context, and we feel that the proper context is the context of Jewish tradition. One might say, well, if these questions are interesting, why simply not discuss them from the standpoint of modern science? Why bother to study Jewish history, or why bother to study these ideas within the context or the framework of their ancient texts? Well, the man who founded this institution, Mordecai Kaplan, had a very fine insight insofar as the whole question of interpretation is concerned. Why do we try to understand the present in terms of the past? He called interpretation spiritual metabolism. Spiritual metabolism. That is to say, we feed ourselves with the ancient texts not to accept them literally, but to see whether we can work on them so we can elicit from them the permanent insights that they have for us. That is to say, we assume our ancestors were not entirely cretinous. We assume that our ancestors had some bright ideas, that they couch those ideas in legend and myth and story and ritual, and in our search for meaning and value, those issues on which science is not authorized to pontificate, we wish to share with them our search and try to ascertain what ideas they have arrived at before. And this question of the oneness of God, the unity of God, is one which has been exercising us for some time. Now, in this synagogue, we do not accept the traditional notion of God, although there's no reason why anybody who comes to the synagogue or even belongs to the synagogue doesn't have a right to retain his or her own idea of God, whatever that idea of God may be. But there is what one almost might describe as an official platform about God. That is to say, this platform does not entertain the notion that God is supernatural, that God is a being above nature. This platform, or this philosophy, or this ideology which invests this institution, which is, as I say, the institution Rabbi Kaplan instituted, he is in his 100th year, derives its idea of God from many sources. This is not the point to go into all these ideas, but basically it is a notion that affirms that God is a function of group life. A Christian writer called Mary Daly has made a very interesting suggestion that God should not be regarded as a noun, but as a verb. I don't know whether she's heard of the Hasidic pseudo-Rabbi, Zalman Schachter, who suggests that the word Jew should not be regarded as a noun, but should be regarded as a verb. That instead of saying, what is a Jew, the question should be, how do we Jew? And instead of asking the question as, what are the meaning and purpose of God, we should rather say, how do we God? I suppose that is one way of approaching the question. One of the prime sources of Kaplan's inspiration, of course, when I say that, it already sounds ridiculous, because actually the idea is very old. The idea is extremely old. One of the ancient psalmists speaks about, could have been King David, speaks about a sense of abandonment because he is excluded from the temple. He says, when will I experience God? What he means is that he doesn't feel that he can experience God as an individual. He needs his group, he needs his ethnic group, he needs his traditions, he needs his symbols, he needs the temple, he needs the places where the holy and sacred things of utmost importance for the ongoing life of his people are gathered together. He experiences the reality of God in a massive throng of pilgrims worshipping in Jerusalem. He does not experience God in his apartment with the blinds pulled down, reading a book about God. So Kaplan's insight, or the insight which he took from Emil Durkheim, the French sociologist, is simply a theoretical way of understanding something which was well known years ago, that God is experienced in the group. It is only the extremely powerful individuals who are able to become hermits and experience God in the solitude of the desert. And they originally come from a group. That is to say, the fact that they have religion is because they come from a group originally. Robinson Crusoe managed very finely on a desert island all by himself because he had with him a Bible, which is the story of a people. It is the group which makes it possible for us to have this experience. Durkheim calls the religious experience that takes place in the group an experience of collective effervescence. So whenever I read that phrase in his magnificent book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, I always think of Alka-Seltzer. And I've toyed long with the idea of suddenly producing a glass of cold water and dropping plop, plop, fizz, fizz, and demonstrating what Durkheim and Kaplan mean by God. That is to say, imagine if one is a drop of water in a glass of water which has not had the benediction of 2 Alka-Seltzer tablets. Life is flat, life is mundane, life is ordinary, one can see through everything. And then somebody comes along, Sammy Davis presumably, and drops 2 of those Alka-Seltzer, and the whole thing begins to bubble up. Life has meaning and purpose. Everything is in a great fervent. What Durkheim, who of course described the Australian Aborigines in his original researches, but in fact applies to all groups, is that somehow when people get together, not just for mundane secular purposes, when people get together to try to maintain those things of value to the community of which they are part, and when they work and when they strive over long periods of time, and don't feel upset because they are going to die because the ideals and the values of the community cannot be manifested in their own lifetime, but have a sense that in the same way that they picked up the torch from those who came before them, they will hand on the torch to those who came after. Then one senses a feeling of meaning and purpose in life. And this is the source of what we understand by God. Now, of course, this is a very far cry from the traditional notion of God as some enormous, powerful giant with a long white beard and a big black yarmulke, which happened to be my particular childhood fantasy of what God looked like. Actually, it's very funny, Elias. It's exactly how our cantor looked like. So I envisaged God as the cantor of our synagogue as a child. Isn't that incredible? He was a man called Silverstone, and he had a long black beard and a long white beard when I knew him, and a big black yarmulke, and that's how for many years I envisaged God. Those of you who still entertain those notions of God, I don't think will take kindly to the notion of God as the effervescence in a glass in which one has placed 2 tablets of Alka-Seltzer. I remember once lecturing at the B'nai B'rith Institute in North Carolina. I don't know why that makes any difference, but anyway. And I was using an idea which wasn't even my own. It was an idea which I'd got from Roland Gittleson. He was trying to explain in one of his books how one can understand the God idea not to consist simply of God as a big giant, a more modern, a more relevant conception of God. He says there are two ways in which one can conceive of as the way in which one works on dough when one makes bread. And as I say this, I have to draw your attention to the fact that the challah that we're going to be eating this morning was baked by Fagel Snyder on Monday. How do I know that? Because it was impossible to work on Monday. The entire synagogue was full of this aroma. It was impossible to concentrate. I mean, people should not be allowed to declare Shabbos on Monday. But apparently, Bill won this in the raffle last year, and Fagel fulfilled her obligation, and the challah is Snyderian challah this morning. I don't mind, as long as we don't have those smells around again during working hours. At any rate, Gittleson was trying to draw the attention between the difference between the person who makes the dough, who kneads the dough and hammers it and slaps it, this was pre-Cuisinart days, and pushes and pulls, and that is doing something to the dough. The other is the operation of the enzymes on the dough. That is to say, one mixes yeast with water and flour, and every aspect of the dough is being, in a very suffused way, but every particle of the dough is being affected upon by the yeast process, the enzyme process. And Gilson went on to say that maybe a better way of looking at God than as a father figure with a long beard and a big yarmulke would be to conceive of God as the yeast of the universe. The next week, I think it was the Jewish Week, it had to be the Jewish Week. Only the Jewish Week would have published such an article. Some irate man who was at the lecture writes a letter, and the headline was, "Reconstructionist Rabbi declares God a cake of dough." You can't win. Try to wean people away from their primordial atavistic conceptions of God as some guilt-engendering father, and they try to ridicule and minimize the whole idea. But this is very closely to what we are getting at. And as for those who say, and this is true even of the most sophisticated, every other day people come to me and say, well, of course you don't believe in God, as if to say the only kind of God, the real God, the God with a beard, the God who is a man, the God who is a person, capital P. And anybody who doesn't believe in that doesn't really believe in God. This again, unfortunately, is a very long and slow, and I regret to say, a tedious process of educating people. There was a time when the term justice meant cruel, vindictive vengeance. It took thousands of years before the term justice began to apply to something of the kind of thing modern human beings try to implement in their courts of law. Would we seriously treat anybody, seriously who came to us and said, because our modern conceptions of justice endeavor to expand and enlarge those primitive conceptions of justice where people lopped people's ears or plucked people's eyes out or chopped people's hands or legs off for stealing a loaf of bread, because our modern ideas of justice do not entertain those notions, we have tried to move beyond vindictiveness and vengeance. Therefore, we should find another word for justice. The onus is on the primitives to find another word for their conception of justice. Or that because liberty, which as recently as the time when this country became a nation, when men like Jefferson and Washington had slaves, indentured slaves, so that the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the term liberty in that phrase included the possibility of holding indentured slaves. Something which most of us today, I think, no matter what our feelings about busing may or may not be, would be offended by ethically. Liberty today could not conceivably, possibly anywhere in the world, even where it is not observed in this understanding, be regarded as a term that could be used to include the possibility of holding indentured slaves. Does that mean that we who use the word liberty, that same word, have to find a new word because it doesn't reflect the same meaning as it did in the 17th and the 18th centuries? The onus is on those for whom the word liberty meant these base, evil, obscene things, that this word could include such horrendous ideas. Theirs is the responsibility to choose another word, not us. We believe that the great value concepts of human life, liberty, justice, mercy, compassion, and above all God, are words which hopefully, like human beings, grow and change and mature. And the fact that we choose to conceive of the nature of divinity or godhood as the functional equivalent in the life of the Spirit to the operation of the enzymes on the dough needs no apology. Or if it does, the problem lies with the person who asks the question, not with us. But as I say, the work of interpretation is long and slow and tedious. And having said that, I know at the end of the service someone will come up to me in the Kiddush and say, it's refreshing to meet a rabbi who doesn't believe in God. I can predict that. It's going to happen. So we carry on. The word God has covered the most incredible notions people are capable of. The term God has been used in connection with the most obscene, violent, unethical, immoral practices and behavior patterns, ideologies and philosophies. And slowly but surely, some men and some women are trying to understand God in a different light. We may not be right, but this is the way we find we can accept and interpret and understand our ancient texts. That is to say, the question of the unity of God becomes a very complicated problem today. We're not blaming anymore a single being for the good and the evil in the world. We are trying to understand how the world as it exists, in which there is good and evil, can be changed. Questions such as, can the world improve? Is the world better today than it was 2,000 years ago? Has man improved? Has man changed? Is society better today? Is there no change? Is it just one big circle over and over again, the same mistakes? As we see swastikas painted all over the place. I saw my first swastika on the way to Philadelphia this week. It left me rather cold, actually. Really, I think people tend to exaggerate when teenagers begin to paint swastikas on the walls. I think one of the great dangers is when Jews begin to scream hysterically. I'm not saying we shouldn't be afraid, shouldn't be worried, but I don't know whether the Ku Klux Klan is again on the move. Are we going to say it's just the same thing all over again, nothing ever changes? Or that in fact we will always be plagued with the mentally deficient in the sphere of morality, and that we have to keep on affirming the fact that there can be change and there can be progress. This is at the heart of the question of the unity of God. I wanted to raise the question today, we're in the middle of this discussion, I wanted to raise the question today of how the Jews got to this notion. We discovered last week that it wasn't just an idea that they entertained. It was something on which they staked their lives, and that is what fascinates us about it. It fascinates us because we don't quite understand what it means. That's the question I want to raise today. Why were they so absolutely opposed to any notion which said the world belongs to many gods, or the world belongs to two gods, but absolutely refused to do anything except insist that God is one? They were prepared to be burnt at the stake. They were prepared to be exiled from one country to another. They were prepared to suffer the most incredible hardships, insisting that they would not give up this principle that God is one. There are several things, the Talmud says, that you can violate, traditional rituals, even beliefs, which you can agree to in order to save your life. But there are three things which no devout Jew can ever give up, even if it means he must lose his life. And central to those three is the affirmation of the unity of God. And I reminded the congregation last week of those Orthodox synagogues where the word echad is prolonged for as long as the Jew who is praying can prolong it, and the daled is sounded with such an anguish that somehow there's an overdetermination here. And that we read from the Mishnah last week that if a man gets up to lead the congregation in prayer and he repeats the word modim twice, which suggests we give thanks that there is more than one God, he has to be silenced immediately and forced to leave the bima. Now there are all sorts of other things that people could say which would offend the congregation, but the only thing that can be said up here for which the penalty is immediately being silenced and led off the bima is to even hint that there is more than one God. And I raise the question that we're better off not trying to think of this in terms of some theological idea. We have to move in the direction of the Marxists and the cultural determinists. People don't get so hung up on an idea such as the unity of God unless it has a central importance in their survival as a group. And I suggested that the unity of God and the affirmation of the unity of God has an adaptational value in terms of the evolution and the survival of the group. Not just the Jewish group, but of other groups also. It's interesting that the Jews are doing much better than the Zoroastrians, for example, against whose views of two gods, the God of good and the God of evil, Isaiah's polemic insistence that God creates good and evil, light as well as darkness, was originally raised in the 5th pre-Christian century. That there is some survival value in the notion that God is one. And the question I want to raise is, how was it that the Jews came to arrive at this notion? And I want to talk briefly this morning about 3 religious viewpoints which are still very much with us in the world today, as is the case with just about all of the theological concepts we discuss in the synagogue, in different shapes and forms, of course. And those 3 notions which lead to monotheism are, first of all, polytheism, which is the belief which entertains that there are many different gods in the world. The second view, which is a word which you may not have come across, is what is called henotheism, spelled H-E-N-O, where one believes that one's God is a good God, but that other peoples have gods too. That is to say, one's own God in whom one believes is not the only God in the world. There are other gods also. And finally, monotheism, the belief that there is only one God, and this central stress and affirmation. And this notion of one God, by the way, is very much bound up with Isaiah's polemic, insisting that God is responsible for good and for evil, because in Jewish tradition, we are enjoined to make a blessing, a benediction, over good and evil. It's a very curious thing. In Jewish life, we make benedictions over all sorts of things, over bread, over wine, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, over seeing a rainbow, over hearing thunder, seeing lightning, seeing new flowers, eating new fruits. Here is a curious thing. We have to make a blessing over good and evil. If you hear some very good news, you make a blessing. If you are saved, delivered from some kind of an accident, you make a blessing. But also, if something bad happens, especially death, the blessing which is recited when one learns of the death of a loved one is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Dayan ha'emet, the righteous judge, affirming the justice of the divine judge. All this is part of this incredible overdetermination which the Jews brought to bear on the notion of the unity of God, and has enormous implications for our thinking today. Where do these ideas come from? First of all, I don't want to insist that polytheism was the first and that this is a unilinear evolutionary development, because there are respectable and responsible views which insist that there was an initial, early monotheism, and the debate has not yet been decided. All I want to draw your attention to is the difference of the 3 different viewpoints. Polytheism, of course, is the best known, and this is the view that not only does not accept the idea of there being a unity in the world, but accepts the fact that there are many different gods, as many gods as there are different elements in the world. In the ancient world, there were not only different, well, the Greek pantheon is probably the best known notion. It moves into a form of animism, the notion that mountains and trees and forests and rivers and parks and cities have gods, many gods. This is one of the forms of polytheism. And this, of course, is what our ancestors turned against in their move towards monotheism. What is not widely recognized is that there was an intermediate stage for our ancestors between polytheism and monotheism, and that is known as henotheism. I'd like to ask you to turn in your prayer books right now briefly to a sentence which you all know, page 81, just to indicate to you how seriously our ancestors once took this notion. That is to say, how our ancestors once did not believe that there was one God over the entire world. This was something that developed among our ancestors. And this phrase is the 4th line, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha neder ba'kodesh. Who is like thee, O Lord, among the mighty? The original meaning of that word, as anybody who knows Hebrew knows, the word Elim does not originally mean mighty. This sentence is a very ancient sentence. It is found in the song sung by the Israelites, crossing of the Red Sea, the Song of Deborah, the book of Exodus. The literal meaning of this verse is, who is like thee, O God, among the other gods? That is the original meaning of that sentence. Who is like thee, O God, O Jewish God, O Hebrew God, among all the other gods? In other words, this is henotheism. The other nations have gods. Ours is the biggest and the best. That's what that sentence means. It's like if New York had a god, and if New Jersey had a god, and Connecticut had a god, and Massachusetts had a god, and Pennsylvania had a god, we would be saying, who is like thee, O God of New York, among the other gods? That is to say, we would not be denying that New Jersey experienced collective effervescence. We would not be denying that Massachusetts experienced collective effervescence. Nor would be denying, God forbid, that Pennsylvania did not experience collective effervescence. All that we would be insisting was that the Big Apple effervescence is the biggest and the best of them all, and could not be compared to the others. So that when our ancestors wrote, Micha Mocha Ba'ilim Adonai, they acknowledged the fact that Ammon had Chmosh, and Moab had Milcom. Or is it the other way around? I always get those two guys mixed up. Weintraub, help. Which is which? What? You weren't listening. And where do you think honesty will get you in this institution, Weintraub? With pleasure, Mr. Weintraub. Who was the tutelary deity of the Moabites? Chemosh. And of Ammon? Milcom. Was it not? Good. I think that'll do. All right. It's the same thing as New Jersey and Connecticut, basically. There you had the Hebrews, okay? An ethnic group within a narrow area. They believed that their God... By the way, does anybody know what the proper name was? Rabbinical students need not answer whether they were listening or were not listening. Does anybody know what the proper name was which our ancestors gave to the Hebraic God? Yahweh. Yes. Yad, He, Vav, He. A very difficult word. We don't know what it means. It is sometimes pronounced Jehovah. It is sometimes pronounced Yahweh, as if it is a word Y-A-H-W-E-H, because the Hebrew letters, the four letters from which it is based, is Yad He Vav He, Y-H-V-H. We don't know, W-H. We don't quite know what it means. At any rate, Yahweh was a proper name. So there you had the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, Chemosh, Milcom. All the nations had their gods. But the affirmation was that the God of Israel was bigger and better than the others, and Micha Mocha Ba'ilim unquestionably means that the Hebraic God could beat up the other gods. That was a very crucial aspect in those days of national sovereignty. One more piece of internal evidence from the very material we are studying, which proves incontrovertibly the existence of a phase of henotheism in the recorded life of our people. And that is the line of the Shema, which Jews take as the equivalent of the Christian's Lord's Prayer, on page 75. Shema Yisrael, on page 75. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. That is not the correct translation, although you will find that translation in every prayer book in the entire world. It is not the correct translation. This is the correct translation. In terms of the henotheistic context of our ancestors' belief at that time when this sentence was first written. Listen, Hebrews, or listen, Israelites. Yahweh is our God. Only Yahweh. Don't get any fancy ideas because they've got Milcom and they've got Chemosh and they've got their God and they've got the other God. Don't look with greedy eyes over the garden fence. If you're a Hebrew, if you're a Jew, then your God is only and exclusively Yahweh. As late as the 8th pre-Christian century, Hosea the prophet refers to Palestine as Eretz Adonai, Yahweh's backyard. Moreover, when King David was exiled into Transjordania, he has left us a bitter lament that he was unable to worship God. And why was King David unable to worship God? He says, Ki geshuni hayom mehistapeach b'nachalat avotai leimor avod Elohim acherim. My brothers have exiled me this day. They have driven me out from enjoying the religious inheritance of my ancestors, saying to me, go serve other gods. Wasn't David a big boy? Just because he'd had a family quarrel in the palace and had been driven out, does that mean to say he couldn't worship God? He couldn't say the Shema in whichever motel he found himself in Transjordania? The answer was, it was only possible to worship the Jewish God if you lived on Jewish soil. In the period of henotheism, are you trying to say something? What's the name of that film star? George. The old guy who plays God. Is he in the congregation this morning? Friend of the Frosts? What? Hannah? No. Huh? But it happened at the same time last week. Maybe it's my wife. She's telling me I've spoken too much. You know, Mrs. Kaplan, when she felt her husband had spoken too long, would sit in the front row and wave. All right. What were we saying? Henotheism, yes. So, the idea was this incredible idea, by the way, an incredible idea which also has modern versions. When Ben Gurion said to us that the only place for a Jew to be is in Israel, and his latter-day descendants insist that the only place where a Jew can be a Jew is in Israel, they are unwittingly perpetuating an ancient, archaic, and somewhat atavistic notion of the limits of the jurisdiction of the God of Israel. That is to say, if you are outside of the territorial boundaries of the land of Israel, you are no longer able to worship the Jewish God. You are obliged to worship the God of the country in which you happen to be. The question I am raising, and I don't have any answer to it, I'm raising the question, and maybe after I've given the tentative answers that I have, members of the congregation might try to have. My own feeling is that when these changes take place, they don't just take place because a group of scholars get together and think. I am not an idealistic historian. I really don't think that groups of scholars change history anyway. They simply record the changes. The idea that a group of Jews sat down and said, let us, this henotheistic idea is okay, but it's bad for UJ Federation. I mean, if we could have everybody believing in the same God, then we could have a worldwide campaign. As it is, we're stuck, and if they're abroad, they say, I didn't contribute. I gave at the office, I gave at the local capital, or whatever it was. I gave to Chmosh. I gave to Milcom. I was in Pennsylvania when the appeal came about. I don't know, that sounds much more realistic than any kind of an ideational influence on this notion. What happened was, at some stage in history, instead of having little glasses of water in which 2 separate Alka-Seltzer tablets were dropped, and everybody felt very happy that this was the way the world should be and always is going to be, somebody conceived of the idea of a big bath in which one dropped a ton of Alka-Seltzer. Now, I don't know what the scientific implications of this is, but some brilliant person in the congregation has got to help me here. That is to say, is there some kind of exponential Alka-Seltzerism, if you get what I'm talking about, right? The idea is that, in other words, is bigger better in the realm of collective effervescence? My feeling would be that would be the case. And let me give you the analogy that I've arrived at. Scientists tell us that there is a tide in a teacup. We don't have the instruments to measure it, because at that stage the instruments would interfere with what is being measured. But wherever there is water in the universe, there are theories that even the liquid in our brains gets affected, which is why people behave rather peculiarly when the new moon is, like today. I mean, the new moon is about to come upon us, and the liquids in the brain, every liquid, the blood in the body, even a teacup, but you can't see the tide in a teacup. If you go to Central Park, those of you who jog, if you want to alleviate your boredom, and you look, you notice there's about a little 1.5 or 2 inches damp little patch on the concrete, which indicates that even in the reservoir there's a tide, but it's not a big tide. You go to the ocean, there's a bigger tide. Really can see the tide. Now, in a sense, divinity that Kaplan is talking about is of that order. That is to say, it is an experience which takes place when one is part of an ongoing group, one is dedicated to the ongoing spiritual value life of that group, and also one is aware of it. In other words, one has to identify it, has to be given a name. It's no good to be like Monsieur Jourdain in Molière's play Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme and get all excited because at an advanced age they tell you what the difference is between prose and poetry, and you get terribly excited about the fact that you've been speaking prose all your life. That's not good enough. Thank you. You have to know about it. In other words, God has to have a name. There has to be a definition given. So what happened when the move went from henotheism to monotheism, somebody had the marvelous idea to get rid of the glasses and have one mass collective effervescence. That is to say, ideationally speaking, that if human beings could experience God in terms of the glass, imagine what a turn-on spiritually it would be if one could feel a sense of effervescence with the entire world, that one would still have the experience of one's group, but the experience of one's group would be an aspect or a function of the effervescence of the entire world. And here again we are now led to another insight of Kaplan. There is no Jewish idea of God, there is a Jewish application of the God idea. This is a central theme of Kaplan's thinking, that all groups believe in some kind of deity or deities or divinity or divinities. There is a universal notion of godhood or divinity. There is a particular application, a Jewish application of the God idea. So one way of looking at it would be to say that one of the reasons why they did this was because they sensed there was a growing feeling that just to associate one's sense of value with a small group isn't enough. Some people try to live their lives finding meaning and purpose only in their own immediate family. Some people try to find meaning and purpose only in themselves as individuals. They don't want children, or they don't have children. Themselves. Some people don't even want to find meaning and purpose in themselves. That's a different story. Some people will go a little further beyond. My country, right or wrong. My church, right or wrong. My synagogue, right or wrong. My community, right or wrong. It's obvious that what we're talking about here is an attempt to make man human. Rabbi Kaplan used to say, man is not yet human. Man is a candidate for humanity. It's a marvelous insight. That is to say, there is constant ongoing striving to try to generate in human thinking not a cosmopolitan sense whereby all the different ethnic traditions are dissolved. On the contrary, we are destined, because of our very human nature, to be born within families and to have parents and to have siblings and to belong to communities. The world is too big to feel a sense of belonging. We cannot become a member of the human race. It is too wide. But what we must endeavor to become in Kaplan's thinking, and this I endorse wholeheartedly, is that we must be able to experience the needs of humanity refracted through the prism of our own historic ethnic religious tradition. That is the heart of Reconstructionism. And in fact, in his later years, Rabbi Kaplan insisted that Reconstructionism was not only for Jews. It was a universal phenomenon, of which Jewish Reconstructionism was only a specific affirmation. How did our ancestors move from being henotheists to being monotheists? I have two more possible interpretations before asking you whether you have any explanations. Another one is that, of course, we know that Palestine was the tramping ground of armies. I don't know why, I'm using the mythological language now, I don't believe in this God, but it's simpler to talk this way. Why did God give the Jews Palestine? Why not Switzerland? Why not California? Why not Florida? I mean, why Palestine? Was that the only place in the world he could find? Sometimes when I read the Hebrew Bible and see the land described as a land flowing with milk and honey, I think of the Yiddish phrase, Mared Zechain. You know, I've heard of people who try to play golf in Israel, they can't even hammer the, what are those things in? It's too hard. Land flowing with milk and honey. This is fantasy. In other words, the more they talk of the land flowing milk and honey, the more they attempt to cover up the fact that Palestine is the grand central station of the Middle East. Everybody goes through it, nobody stays there. That's why when in the 9th pre-Christian century our ancestors were looking for a piece of territory, the only bit of real estate to which everybody else had the stake to claim was Palestine. Nobody wanted it. The fact is that it was where the armies moved through. The Egyptians moved to Babylonia, and the Babylonians moved to Egypt. Alexander the Great moved down to Egypt, and the Ptolemies went up to the Seleucids. The Hebrews didn't live on the ground, on the flat, because if they lived on the flat, every 5 minutes somebody else was running over them. They were smart. You read the Bible carefully, in the 10th and the 9th pre-Christian centuries, they lived on the hills, and they looked down. I think that's why they got to Echad. It's like a tennis umpire. Babylonians, Egyptians. 30 love, Egyptians, Alexander the Great. 40, sorry. It's coming down with this. That is to say, if you were to sit in Grand Central Station for a month, you would learn a lot about human life. And if you saw these nations riding out full of the macho, with their white horses, and the ladies' tokens, the ribbons, and the shining armor, and a week later saw them coming back with their kishkas hanging out, you would understand the meaning of shalom. Sometimes I think of the Jew as a little guy in between two big guys. It's like in a subway train, the IRT on a Monday morning. Anyways, right in the middle, the Egyptians down here, the Babylonians here, the Greeks here, the Hellenists, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies. Who cries shalom? The guy in the middle. That's cultural determinism with Marxist overtones. Now, the other possibility is this, and let's go back to our New Jersey syndrome. Supposing, in fact, America consisted of states, I know some people would like this, which were totally autonomous, and there was no federal government. And every state did what it wanted to do. We would be back in a condition where every state had a god. And then supposing there was something like the Civil War, and finally you had the United States of America. And although the states still retained proudly their independence on some levels, there was a certain federal level where they all had to be unified. Some gifted poet, some gifted spiritual genius might contemplate the meaning of a multitude of states, each with their own god, being united into a federation of states, and conceive of this as being an adumbration of a spiritual insight that to have a god just of Pennsylvania, to have a god just of Massachusetts, to have a god just of New York, wasn't the highest form of living. That perhaps the whole idea of federation on earth could be reflected in a federation in heaven. That there could be a United States of the world in which there will be one unifying power. It seems to me that precisely that phenomenon took place, it certainly took place in England, where there was once Wales and Scotland and England, and there is now, of course it's coming a little unstuck these days, but that's a different story. There's always a tendency to become self-centered, and in fact in Jewish life also, in recent years, for very understandable reasons. The old henotheism is coming back again. That is to say, ours is biggest and best. We'd rather be on our own. We don't want to mix up with anybody else. Is it conceivable that some ancient poet who saw the slow unification of the 12 tribes, again we use the language of mythology, suddenly broke through to the insight on the basis of the events that he saw in front of his eyes, that the real God had to be the God of all mankind and not just the God of one group of people, even of the Jews? How else would the Jews have survived over the thousands of years that separate us from them, our ancestors? I said it was adaptational. Adaptational because, you see, when the Assyrians came down like a wolf on the fold, the best method of survival was to believe that the Assyrians were not an autonomous, independent group who had their own God, who were coming to destroy the Jewish God because they had more chariots and more horses, but to experience the God of the entire world as using the Assyrians as the rod of his anger to punish a recalcitrant Israel. That is how we survived over the years. We have a few minutes for questions from the congregation. I'm very happy to entertain questions or any ideas as to how monotheism... Yes, please. Michael.
Maybe the adaptational model can be extended into the biological model. You can never ask the question in biology where a mutation came from. You can only really ask the question, why did the mutation survive?
Good.
And
I'll buy that.
the idea of a unified God is a mutation. Somehow it came into being for that particular reason. And if a people doesn't have a state, doesn't have a piece of land, it doesn't survive without something to unify it. You have multiple gods and anything goes. You need one particular principle, either it's a piece of land or an idea. And it's simply by luck that the idea came into being. And if the idea had not come into being, it wouldn't be here. And it doesn't, can't really ask why it came. The fact is that it did come somehow, and it's that coming that produced the result that we have now.
Yes, did you all hear that? You didn't all hear that. It's a very, very important point. The point that Michael was making is that, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, that mutations, you all know what mutation is in the realm of biology. An animal is born with a flap of skin under its arm. Under normal circumstances, that is an impediment, because it can't run away from predators quickly enough. But if that particular group of animals happens to be on a promontory and all the food sources have dried up, and the only way to get off that promontory is to glide, and a few animals are born with this abnormality and they are able to glide down, then the ones that have the abnormality become normal, and the ones that were normal become abnormal, and goodbye, they're finished. That's mutation in its simplest possible way. Now, what Michael is saying is something very, very, very stimulating. That not only can there be mutations in terms of a sixth finger or a piece of webbed footing between one or the other toe or a piece of skin under the arm, there is such a thing as an ideational mutation. That somebody comes along with a weird idea. Now, the question is, a weird idea will either survive or not survive. The question is it needed? That is to say, does the group among whom the person with a mutational idea exists, does that group need it or not need it? My feeling often has been that the prophets were such a mutation. As a matter of fact, this is where it comes from. The prophets were abnormal when the Jews had a state of their own. Those people who today criticize the state of Israel. There was a letter in the New York Times last week, did you all see it? About the number of countries that Israel supplies military weapons to. It made me cringe. But I understand that in order to survive, Israel has to have weapons. The prophets would have inveighed against that letter. The prophets would have written letters to the New York Times saying that if this is the way the state of Israel can only survive by becoming the arms distributor to the third world, it's better that there wouldn't be a state of Israel at all. But as long as the state of Israel survives, they had to sell arms. The prophets will be regarded as slightly sick. And as a matter of fact, if you read Commentary magazine and you listen to the new conservative movement in Jewish life, you'll hear that in fact anybody who talks like the prophets is regarded as slightly demented. People say, yeah, the prophets were good when we were on the floor. But now that we have a state of our own, who needs the prophets? Keep them in Hebrew. Let the bar mitzvah children sing them. That's enough. Turn them to music. But you see, when the Jews lost their state, the prophets suddenly became of adaptational value. When you read the Bible, you think that the prophets were front page news every day because the prophets wrote the Bible, that's why. But if you could open the equivalent of the New York Times in the year 590, 4 years before the temple was destroyed, what would be on the headlines would be the doings of the king and the nobleman. And some woman would be telling you what happened at which cocktail party in the palace. And the prophets wouldn't even be mentioned. It was after the temple was destroyed, people began to realize that they had in their midst some birds, some lizards with bits of skin under their arms that might help them to float and avoid extinction. So what Michael has done is to add a very, very important dimension to what we're talking. I accept that theory. I think that we survived because we survived. We survived through the prophetic spirit. And the big question in Jewish life today is, have the Jews become normal again? Can we afford to disband with the modes of adaptation we used in the past? Or do we still have to hang on for dear life to those modes because we're not yet out of the woods? The swastika that I saw en route to Philadelphia this week seems to suggest to me that we ought not to jettison our prophets as being abnormal too soon. Fagel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say, before you mentioned the prophets, that the large amount of this mutation came with the exile to Babylonia. That here they were all about Nechar, and wasn't that the beginning?
No, Fagel makes a very important point. She says it didn't happen until they got to Babylonia. The temple was destroyed in the year 586. I don't think it's as easy as that. If you look at the history of the Bible, for example, the canonization of the Bible, these ideas began to be bruited about as early as the 9th pre-Christian century. And for years I agonized over that question. I couldn't understand why didn't the whole prophetic Yiddishkeit, rabbinic Judaism movement begin after the destruction of the temple. Why is there unequivocal evidence that certain thinkers in ancient Israel were already involved and enmeshed with this mutation? And the answer is very simple. I got it from Professor Sale Baron's Social and Religious History of the Jewish People, in the first volume of which he describes how in the middle of the 9th pre-Christian century, the year was 838, there was a battle called the Battle of Karkar, which involved the king of Israel and the king of Syria against the Assyrians. And Baron says this was the last time that the Jews, the Israelites, fought a battle in which their political power, their military power, mattered at all. From that day on, they were swept within the orbit of Assyria's drive to the Mediterranean. And therefore, you see, what happened was that certain sensitive spirits were able to understand ahead of time. How was it that William Blake was able to understand the implications of the Industrial Revolution on the basis of a few smoking factory chimneys? How is it that certain artists, and this truly is the hallmark of the artist, that the artist is able to extrapolate from one factory to the Industrial Revolution? That is to say, one battle. We don't even know whether they won or they lost the battle. It's not important. It wasn't relevant. They were politically impotent from that moment onwards. And what happened was that the artists and the scientists, the artists and the poets anticipated what was going to happen. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes, Matthew.
Perhaps the fact that we don't connect our God with a land comes not as a mutation, but because it's the founding fact of our experience that we managed to get out of Egypt, another land under another God. Our God operated there, so that the people was created without the connection to the land.
Well, Matthew's point is a very important point also, and I think Michael already indicated that. I think it's Heschel who says that the Jews live in time, not in space. It's a vastly overestimated notion, but the fact is that when you look at the history of the Jewish people right up to the present moment have lived most of their collective life in terms of numbers outside of Palestine, Israel, rather than inside. So that in a real sense, that God has become for us the equivalent of territory. The Kabbalistic statement, Kudshabicha ve'oraita v'Yisrael chadhu, God, Israel, and the Torah are one, that Jewish trinity. The Torah and God and the Jewish people, that's all we've got. That is to say, the Jewish people, our stock in trade, Jews, the Torah, that which we study to find meaning and purpose from, and God, who is the guarantor that that law is not just a random chance thing, but something that expresses the very essence of what it is to survive and exist as a people. Far more important than the land. The land, you see, has a messianic dimension, and that's very confusing to us. When we sing at the Seder service, Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim, that is not the Yerushalayim of Teddy Kollek, without any disrespect to Teddy Kollek's Jerusalem. Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim is the messianic Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that will rise at the end of days, when all the world is at peace. It is the end of time. I'm sorry, we have to stop now in the middle of our deliberations. I've got time for one more question. I'm not going to call Rabbi Lewis because I'm going to give him a chance, our visitor from Lincoln Square.
Well, I have to say, Lincoln Square, that was solved.
That's all right.
In terms of your discussing henotheism and monotheism, I'm not all that sure that monotheism is a step up from henotheism when we look at the results of what has happened. I think one of the corollaries of this henotheism, that nations, tribes had their own gods, their own deities, was a sort of benign tolerance of other nations and other gods. Occasionally, you get out there on the street corner or in the land of Palestine and have a fist fight or a war, but there was not this sort of theological, spiritual imperialism. It was more of a territorial, political imperialism. What we have today, the more advanced, sophisticated, universal gods, whether it's Jesus or Allah, is the idea that not only is your God the one God, it allows one to impose one's God, one's beliefs, one's interpretations on everybody else. Here in this country, we have the evangelicals who say that if you do not accept our way, there is no salvation. They kind of grudgingly say they accept the First Amendment to the Constitution because that is the American way. But those who don't accept Jesus will not make it to the pearly gates. And in Judaism, on the one hand, we have the Aleinu, in which we pray for all nations to come to understand God. But at the same time, we have the tradition of the Noahide laws and how to deal with the Gentiles. That there is such a thing as a righteous Gentile. We are not honor bound to go out and slaughter everyone who does not accept kashrut. And we can live with them.
You're making an extremely important point, and I just realized that in fact the Jews did in one sense what Alexander the Great did, and of course the Christians did it also. Not a territorial imperialism, but an ideological imperialism. But you see now, I wasn't being funny about my remark about Lincoln Square, you know perfectly well that some of my best friends worship at Lincoln Square. That's why we don't believe in the chosen people here. Because you see, we find relegating the non-Jews to the condition of the children of Noah is an insult. And I want you to understand very clearly what Kaplan says about the idea of many gods. In other words, every nation, every group has the right to have its God, but its God should be an application of the universal God idea, not a God who needs to emancipate other people and convert them to his or her belief, whatever the God is. Do you understand? This is a very important point. In other words, that exactly is why Reconstructionists could not accept the chosen people idea. Because if there was only one God, but that was a Jewish God, who favored the Jewish people, who chose the Jewish people, and divided the world up into two groups, the good guys and the bad guys, the Jews being the good guys and the others the bad guys. And we said to them, we don't want to get rid of you, we need Shabbos Goyim. Who's going to poke at the fire? We don't want everybody to become Jews. That wasn't a virtuous thing to say. What it was saying was that we don't mind as long as you accept that we're numero uno, you can carry on, and if you're very nice, you can come and have a schnapps in heaven with us also, the best ones. That's a very put-down kind of thing. I would like to know how Rabbi Riskin sits with that ethically in New York today. The idea that the world consists of Jews, who are the number ones, and the Goyim, who have to have 7 laws, but they're not the real thing, as my mother would say. It's very difficult for us. We have had a lot of problems, but we've decided to insist in 1981 that the Jews are the chosen people is ethically unacceptable. That there are many different groups in the world, that each of these groups ought to have a God, that is to say, a central rallying value point. All that we ask of them and of ourselves as Jews is, let this not be a Jewish God or a Christian God that wants to ideologically colonialize the rest of the world. I share your concern about the evangelical movement. People who say that Jewish prayers don't get to God. This kind of incredible chutzpah that we hear. Although I would prefer just to ignore that kind of nonsense. One ought to not dignify certain things. When I get into an argument with somebody, it's because I respect them. When I don't respect somebody, I don't bother to dignify the matter with an argument. And I think we Jews, when somebody says that Jewish prayers don't get to God, should treat that kind of comment with what it deserves. You know, Aristotle was once kicked by a mule and decided to overlook the insult, considering the source whence it emanated. What Kaplan would say is, there is a universal God idea which represents our asymptotic striving to perfection, which we never hope to reach, and our very notion of immortality or the next world is a statement of how we hope to get to that one day. There should be no Jewish God or Christian God or Muslim God. There should be a Jewish and a Christian and a Muslim application of the God idea. What this means is, if our Jewish application of the God idea falls short ethically from what is happening in the rest of the world, then we can enhance our idea of God with ideas that come to us from other cultures. I'm thinking particularly of the notion of the equality of the sexes, which is causing such difficulties in traditional Judaism, but which unequivocally will have to become accepted sooner or later. This is an insight which came from outside of us and is going to have to be absorbed. On the other hand, by the same token, if the Christians and the Muslims could learn a few tricks from us, ethically speaking, then let them learn them, and let them put their values, those values, into them also. The Kaplan idea of God is a difficult idea to understand, and even more difficult to live by. But we continue to do this every week, not just on the happy occasions when Abigail is bat mitzvah. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.